The raven's claw had scratched the wax. A hairline fissure ran through the rose's petals. Tiny, but it parted as Jon worked his thumb beneath it, heat leaking from the meat of his palm into the brittle seal. The gold wax sloughed like a winter berry crushed between teeth. Davos watched, quiet, wind tugging at the fur collar he wore as if the air were a hungry dog. Below the wall walk, the yard was a spill of gray. Ash wood stacked by the smithy, a cartwheel leaning against a snowbound trough, a boy swinging a blunt practice sword at nothing but his own breath. "Another from the south," Davos said, voice soft. "They've a way of writing that makes a man feel warm even when he's not." Jon slid the vellum free. The script was delicate, perfumed with something faint. Honey? Summer wine? Felt like a lie to find such scent in Winterfell. Yet the words were weighted, and each curl of the ink seemed steeped in purpose. Lord Jon Snow, King in the North. He did not flinch at the title. Others had given it to him enough times now that its surprise had worn down like the teeth of a river stone. The letter did not waste itself on flattery. It spoke first of survival. "My granddaughter lives." A clean arrow, that line. It punched through the frost of his suspicion, left a hole where chill became motion. He read on. The handwriting changed after the second line, a different hand, assured, elegant. Margaery Tyrell wrote with a measured grace, like a singer setting the first bar of a tune no one had learned yet. Olenna Redwine's opening had been blade straight. Margaery's portion was a ribbon tied around it. "I escaped the September before its ruin. I escaped because I listened to an old woman better than the young king did. Forgive the pride of a survivor, your grace, but I am alive, and life must be turned toward something." He drew breath, esteemed, and was blown away. "Bad news?" Davos asked. "It depends who you are," Jon said, and passed the vellum into the smudged, careful hands of the Onion Knight. Davos read swiftly, the way men of the sea learn to measure wind. "H&H," he muttered. "The Queen of Thorns wishes to speak of harvests and banners, not flowers." He looked up. "They propose what I thought they might, though I did not dare to name it." On the rampart across from them, Sansa's hair looked like a russet flame in the hard sunlight. She had paused where the walkway thinned, one gloved hand on a crenel, eyes to the yard and then to Jon, reading him as she had read him since they were children, from the set of his shoulders and the shape of his silence. When their eyes met, she did not smile. She came. He waited for her in the stairs' shadow, where the stones were slick with a thin skin of ice that hadn't felt sun in days. Sansa reached them with only the soft rasp of wool on stone to mark her coming. "What do they want?" she asked. "What all the Southrons want," Davos said too kindly. "When their weather turns." Sansa regarded the paper, unread and yet understood. "A marriage," she said. Jon nodded once. A marriage, Margaery Tyrell to Jon Snow. The ink did not use the word love. Praise the gods. It used the language of wheat and spears. It spoke of Tommen dead, of Loras burned, of mace ascended to ash and then to rumor, of a rosebush hacked and yet not wholly uprooted. It spoke of pledge. The Reach would rise behind a northern king who did not bend knee to a lioness, nor a dragon's daughter. It spoke of dower and dowry, of barges laden with grain, of the Hightower's shadow over Old Town, of reluctant lords who would follow Margaery because she made obedience taste like honey instead of iron. "It is a trap," Sansa said, though her voice held no certainty, only the memory of traps sprung and teeth still bleeding from them. "It might be," Jon said, "but it might also be a road." "Roads go south," Davos said, eyes on the yard, on the boy who had wearied of cutting air and now leaned on the blunt edge of his practice blade to watch, mouth open. "South is where we'll have to go if winter turns into a war we're too hungry to fight." Sansa took the letter with a care that bordered on disdain, though Jon knew it wasn't disdain. It was the precision of someone who had learned how easily paper could set people alight. She lifted it to her nose and smiled without humor. "They always smell like gardens," she said, "even when they're bleeding." Jon thought of the smell of wildfire as men had described it, sweet until it was poison, and then he placed the memory aside before it became prophecy. "We can host them," he said, Hear them in the hall. Refuse nothing, agree to nothing, and watch. Sansa folded the letter along the same lines it had arrived with. Grandmother and granddaughter, she said. Do you know that woman, Jon? Not the old one, the young one. Do you know what it means to be loved by a woman who learned politics from a thorn bush? Jon coughed out something like a laugh. No. I know what it is to be guided by a woman who learned to survive wolves. It is sharp. It is honest. Then keep that truth, Sansa said, meeting his eyes. She will come with silk, but she is as dangerous as any blade we have seen. I would say do not go near her if I thought we could afford to keep our distance. We can't, Davos said, and he did not pretend sorrow about it. You've kept the North alive with meat and discipline. The Reach can keep it alive with bread. And if bread is bait? Sansa asked. Then we'll try it with our own hooks, Davos said, and see who ends up on the board. Jon closed his eyes and felt, for an instant, the Godswood's breath on his face. Young leaves, cold sap, the iron smell of winter running in the roots. We bring them, he said. We feed them. We listen. If the gods give us a thread, we'll follow it. If it knots around our necks, we cut it. He thought of ghost white fur and the music of the snows, of the words beneath the words on the vellum. I escaped because I listened. There was a person inside that script, not just a sigil. Sansa slid the letter inside her cloak, where it vanished like a sparrow disappearing into a hedge. I'll have rooms prepared, she said. Warm ones, with quilts from the thick chest, not the thin. And I'll set the table with the best of what we have. If we mean to weigh them, we should be generous on the scale. She left them, her step leaving no sound but the small clicking of a clasp against bone toggles. Davos leaned both elbows on the frostbitten stone and looked south. I'll have a word with Tormund, he said. He'll want to glower at them. Might as well direct the glowering usefully. Jon stayed where he was until the cold found its way through the thick of his gloves and numbed the meat of his fingers. When he finally moved, he did so not toward the hall or his bed or the training yard, but across the wall walk to the stairs that led to the Godswood. He needed the tree's red eyes on him. Not approval, just witness. Snow spoke softly under his boots as he went. The air had the pearly, close light of a sky thinking about more weather. In the Godswood, the heart tree waited, its face as old as any promise. He put his palm against the bark and let it drink his heat. A southern flower in a northern winter, he thought. Maybe flowers learned to be dangerous when men insisted on picking them. He did not ask the old gods for an answer. He asked them to be present when he chose one. They were. As he left, a raven watching from a branch twitched its wings and muttered to itself. He glanced up and smiled without meaning to. You've seen stranger things, he told the bird, cocked its head, black eye like ink. He imagined the letters it might write if ravens had hands. Short ones, probably. Cold. True. Outside the gate, a curl of sunlight found an icicle and turned it into a line of fire. Then the light shifted, and it was only ice again. The cold took first the fingertips, then the memories of warmth that lived inside them. Margaery had grown up under a sky that smelled of roses when it rained, where even the wet had sweetness in it. This cold had teeth. She learned to anticipate where it would bite next, to name each bite as it came. Ears, throat, knees, teeth, yes, a brief and piercing sting when she laughed at something Olenna said and the air carved its mark on the soft inside of her lips. Don't lick them, Olenna said without looking up. As a girl I did once and the skin cracked. I bled on a boy's hand and he fainted. It ruined the moment. What moment? Margaery asked, cheeks aching around the smile that came even here. The first time you were kissed? Don't be silly, Olenna said. The first time I asked a boy a question and he realized he didn't have an answer. She adjusted the furs at her shoulders with the economy of an old woman who has long since stopped hoping someone else will do it for her. There was something devotional in the way she handled fabric. Even here on the road, each tug and smoothing was like a prayer said for a god who might actually be listening. How much farther until this Winterfell of theirs? 2 days, said Ser Lambert. riding at Margaery's other side. The rose on his shield dulled with a wash of frost. "The roads kinder in the trees, my lady. Less wind. Kind winds are the best lies," Olenna muttered. "They make you believe the world is briefly with you, and then they drop you in a drift." Margaery's mare blew out a ribbon of steam that caught the sun like cloth dipped in silver. Above the bare crowns of trees, the sky was a thin porcelain blue. She had tried, on the first day north, to compare the light to something she knew. The gleam on olive oil as it fell from a spoon, the pale belly of a fish in the shallows. But this light had no analog. It wasn't water or metal. It was itself. "You're thinking pretty thoughts," Olenna said. "A needle finding flesh without malice. Save them. They're no use where we are going." "An alliance is a pretty thought," Margaery said. "Even when it isn't. Especially when it isn't. You escaped the September because you learned to stop believing in the hands of pretty thoughts. Keep that lesson." Margaery breathed, and with the breath came the brief memory of heat under stone, of a corridor in the Red Keep where the sun could never reach. She had turned a corner there and felt something wrong at the edges of her skin. A wrongness so absolute it returned her to childhood, when she had once woken in her bed to find a wasp crawling on her lip and had held herself so still that it went away. That was how she left the September. She knew and she moved. Many did not. She had only once looked back. The glass was burning even as it fell. She had scented flowers. Later, ash. Now snow. Jon Snow, she tried, aloud, to name the man whose name kept pressing like a thumb against the soft of her mind. She had not written to a stranger because she fancied the romance of winter. She had written because the world had thinned to a wire and she needed men who knew how to walk it. He had stood up when death meant to sit him down. He had turned a broken hall into a singing hall with 3 words and then turned his head when they called him king, as if he knew the crown would bite. Rumor was a reckless horse in the south. It loved to run. But some rumors went at a thoughtful pace, finding their path by scent rather than speed. Those rumors said he was stubborn where it mattered and soft where it mattered too, that he kept his promises and his silences and his ghosts. "Do you think he's handsome?" Olenna asked, as if beauty were a ledger that might yet be balanced. "Perhaps," Margaery said, "in the way a cliff is handsome. And cliffs make poor husbands once they tumble." "Remember that." "I remember," Margaery said, but she also remembered the way Tommen slept, one hand curled near his mouth. She had thought then that she would never be cruel because the world had given her that boy and asked her not to. Then the world had taken him and taken her certainty with him. A scout came back at a trot, horse's sides dark with sweat that steamed in the air. "Caravan," he called. "Small, sickly, 2 wagons, children. They're stuck in ruts." "Northmen?" Olenna asked. "Small folk," the scout said. His mouth pinched against the cold as if in worry that it might bite off something he said. "I think from the neck." Olenna's eyes cut to Margaery. Margaery nodded. "We help them," she said. "If we ask to share bread with wolves, we should show them we know how to share it with lambs." "Very pretty," Olenna said, and then, not unkindly, "and also correct." They found the little caravan stalled where the road shouldered close to a shallow stream glazed in dun ice. A boy sat with his legs tucked under him in a burlap sack slit to make a cloak, face raw and wind-burnt, eyes the clear blue of eyes that have cried until salt is no longer a surprise. His mother, Margaery guessed it, stood with her hands gripped on a yoke, as if she herself could haul the wagon from the ruts by will and rage and the wiry stem of her own spine. Margaery did not let the guards be first. She went forward, her horse's hooves placing themselves with the cautious grace of a creature who has no wish to be heavy where heaviness hurts. "May I?" she asked the woman, and only then did the woman's ears register the south in the music of her words. The woman's mouth tightened the way cloth tightens on a line. "It don't matter who you are," she said. "We need hands." "Then I am hands," Margaery said, and slipped from her saddle. The cold bit the soles of her feet even through the leather. She did not begrudge it. She liked, sometimes, to be reminded what she was made of and what she wasn't. She took the yoke. Men eased their shoulders against the wagon's flank. The boy sobbed once, hard, and then pulled it back into himself as if he could smother sound by will. Margaery leaned. The wood did not move. She leaned more. She felt ridiculously, as if she had placed her shoulder against the whole season and asked it to hurry along. The ruts released with a sound like a sucked tooth. The wagon labored up. Someone laughed, short and blessedly rude. The boy's sob came out now as a laugh as well, as if laughter were the only shape that sound could take to leave him. "What do you carry?" Margaery asked when the immediate work was done and the cold made its claim again. "Turnips," the woman said. "Children, a goat if he lives until night." She lifted her chin, the line of it stubborn as any Lady Margaery had ever seen at court. "We're going to Winterfell. They say there's meat in the barrels there." "Not much, but some." "There is," Margaery said, and did not say yet that the barrels would be heavier if the Reach sent barges up the Mander and then wagons overland. A chain of metal and grain and hope that would not break if she held it hard enough. Words were better when they were used as the end of work rather than the beginning. "May we ride with you a while? Our horses will flatten the snow for your wheels." The woman looked at her for a long, measuring moment. South met North and recognized in each other a particular species of courage. The kind that keeps going because to stop would be to admit that there is such a thing as enough. "You may," the woman said, and then, because she had manners even with her shoes wet, added, "My lady." They went together, and the little caravan's wheels sang a new song as they found the track that the Reach horses stamped into the snow. Olenna watched from her saddle, eyes bright with something that was not sentiment. "You feed them," she said, quietly enough that only Margaery could hear. "But do not pretend that you do not also feed the eyes that will watch you in that hall. Let them see you put your hands to what hurts and make it move." "I do not pretend," Margaery said. "I choose." "Then choose him," Olenna said. "But do not let him choose for you." Margaery said nothing. She thought of a heart tree with a face carved into it, and a man carved by winters. She wondered what shape her own face would take if the cold had its way with it, if the rose in her name learned to hold snow in its cupped petals. She wondered if she would like who she was when that happened. By afternoon, the road rose. Trees parted. In the far distance, where the world seemed to have built itself a low gray fortress against weather and men alike, Winterfell took its shape from stone. Smoke rose. Flags hung limp, stiff-edged in the cold. The boy in the burlap sack made a sound that was not laugh or sob but something else. The noise a creature makes when it sees shelter and cannot yet believe it. Margaery let her horses pace slow, though the men were eager now that there was an end to their effort. She looked, and tried not to look like a woman looking at a fate she meant to kiss. Warmth hit her like a story. It made promises as soon as it touched skin. The hall's heat was not southern and scented. It was practical, smelling of fat and wood smoke and men who knew the worth of a good fire. Margaery lowered her hood and let the cold lift its teeth from the edge of her ear. Sound swelled, the hiss of logs collapsing inward, the clatter of a trencher, the laugh of a giant of a man whose beard seemed to have never known restraint. That man looked at her as if she were a creature from a tale he hadn't yet decided to mock or admire. Jon Snow rose. She did not feel disappointment and was quietly pleased about that. He was not pretty. He was beautiful in the way a winter night is beautiful when you have shelter. Stark, precise, without excess. His hair was a dark banner loosed in the hall's heat. His eyes were the color of something you might drink if you were thirsty at the end of a long road. River water just before dawn. He did not smile, and she loved him immediately for it. Men who reflexively smiled at meetings were men who had taught their faces to lie on their behalf. "Lady Margaery," he said. He did not call her queen. She did not want him to. The title had become a room she did not enter unless forced. "Your Grace," she said, giving him what the room required even as she watched his face to see if the word slid off his skin. It did not. It sank in, and his jaw shifted as if the weight of it still surprised him. "Thank you for receiving us. Thank you for not freezing on the way," he said, and a ripple of amusement moved through the hall. Not laughter, but the shared relief of attention recognized and named. Olenna stepped up beside Margaery like a little ship coming to dock beside a larger. "We've brought manners and a problem," she announced. "We'll use both if you let us." Sansa's mouth, at the high table's other end, twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Davos Seaworth looked as if he had swallowed a splinter, not because anything hurt, but because he was trying to work it into a position where it would help. They were seated, the placements telling their own stories. Margaery beside Jon, because this was a lesson they meant to teach the room. Proximity is not presumption, but it can become it quickly, beware. Olenna beside Sansa, two women whose spines had learned similar languages. Tormund leaned back to look at Margaery obliquely, and then leaned forward again, unconcerned with the subtlety that scented every other gaze. "A rose in snow," he said with the great cheer of a man who enjoys the absolutes of metaphor. "You'll wither or you'll learn to like the cold. I hope for the second. Withered roses make poor crowns. Men with opinions make poor gardeners," Olenna said across Sansa, sweet as arsenic. Tormund grinned at her, delighted at finding a foe worth wrestling in words if not in antlers. Bread came and butter hard as oak knots until the heat made it give. Margaery ate. She did not take the smallest portion, nor the largest. She told a short story about the boy on the road and let the ending lift somewhere other than triumph. Men thought women were sentimental when they spoke of children. She had found, by practice, that the unsentimental line between pity and practicality made them listen harder. "Your barrels will do more good than your spears," she said, and then left the sentence alone. "Not if the dead come," a man at a lower table said, sober as a ledger. "No," Margaery agreed, and did not ask if the dead truly did. That question had no use here. "But the living are always more numerous until they aren't. Feed them. People who are fed are less easy to turn into tools." A murmur like a cat's purr followed this, its content ambiguous, its warmth real enough. Jon cut venison with a knife that caught the fire's miniature stars and made them run along the edge. "The Reach has grain," he said. "The North has cold. Perhaps together they make a winter that does not kill us." "Marriage," Olenna said, and she said it the way a mason might say arch. Not romantic but structural. The hall quieted a notch. There was nothing rude in it. Men slowed their chewing, the crackling of the logs seemed to listen. Even the dog under the table put its chin down between its paws and watched with those eyes dogs have for events that might involve bones. Margaery rested her fingertips on the cup before her. They did not tremble. "I would be your partner," she said, and met Jon's eyes across the width of the table, across the width of the sea and land and deaths that separated them. "Not your decoration, not your counsel only when you ask. Your partner when you ask and when you don't." The boldness hit the room like a gust that comes through a door and reminds the fire that it is a small thing against the cold. Sansa's lashes flickered down, then up. Approval or warning, Margaery did not yet know. Jon did not look away from her to see how his hall was reacting. She marked that down in the quiet book she kept in her head, where each man and woman she met had a page, and on Jon's page she wrote, "Does not consult the faces around him when asked to choose his own." "We are not the realm," he said. "We are two corners of it, and the middle is a sea of swords." "Most seas can be crossed with bread," Margaery said, and the corner of Davos's mouth twitched again in that way that seemed to belong less to humor than to recognition. Perhaps he had said something like this to someone in a king's hearing once and watched the words go to war and return dressed as other things. Bread, and the kind of justice men can understand when they sit down at night and ask themselves whether to get up in the morning. Tormund snorted into his horn. "Justice, little word for a long night. Do your flowers know it?" "Flowers know sun and water and hands," Olenna said. "They also know knives. We are not ignorant of what survives winter." The negotiation did not happen at the high table. It happened the way such things should, in the spaces around the feast, between bites, under the arch of a low conversation. As men leaned back on benches and women refilled cups and the dog shifted inside. Jon spoke low with Sansa, with Davos. Margaery spoke low with Olenna, with the Manderly envoy who tasted his words before giving them. as if he were not only a man but the river that named his house. The sense of a thing took shape the way a carving does. Not all at once, but with strikes that at first seem random until the face appears and then it cannot be unseen. Later, in the corridor outside the hall, where the air cooled and the breath left their mouths in twin white threads, John and Margaery walked. They did not touch. It would have been too easy a language. "Why me?" he asked at length, not wounded but curious, as a hunter might ask why the stag had taken one path through the snow and not another. "Because you were already a bridge," she said. "Between life and death, if half of what I hear is true. Between bastard and lord. Between rules written by men who have never been cornered and the truth that lives in corners. I intend to be queen of something other than a chair. I would build, and I would have you build with me." His breath plumed and was gone. "You would be queen of the Reach," he said. "And I would be king of the north and my partner in the south," she said. "You would not be my lord, nor I yours. We would be what most marriages talk about and few are." He looked toward the snow-dark garden where the dead roses of the maester's plot stood black against white. "I have known a marriage arranged for war," he said. "It ended before it began. The war ate it. I won't feed another like that to another war." "Good," she said. "Then we must learn to starve the wars." They stopped where the corridor narrowed, and the cold pressed closer as if trying to eavesdrop. She studied his face because that was what the moment asked of her. Attention without greed. "You don't frighten easily," she said. "That's fortunate." "I do. I am frightened often. What saves me is that I learned not to mistake fear for a command." "We will speak to the gods," he said, an apology in it for asking her to stand beneath trees that had watched his ancestors and judged them. "If you mean what you say, you will meet them where I did when I chose all the other choices that made this one possible. I do not intend to be queen of something I cannot also pray in," she said, and felt suddenly, sickeningly, how much this decision would mean. The September had been a room that taught her how much a god could be used. Perhaps the gods here were less useful. Perhaps they were more themselves. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed, and went back into the light to find Olenna's eye and meet it like a duel where both women were smiling. The gods would took cold and made it into a sound. A very soft crackle, as if someone far away were crushing handfuls of sugar. The heart tree watched. Its eyes were not blood. They were the memory of blood. Margaery's boots sank a thumb's depth into the drift. No wind moved. Even the ravens, those bureaucrats of death and messages, were absent for once, as if this meeting did not interest them because it changed nothing on their ledger in the sky. Sansa stood near an aspen, hands in her sleeves, her gaze not sectarian but familial. This was the kind of work stark women watched across centuries. Olenna's chin was high, a posture she wore as if it could hold her upright in any storm. Perhaps it could. John took Margaery's hands. His gloves were off. Warmth was a shock, and then a greed. Her fingers wanted to take it and hoard it in her sleeves like stolen sweetmeats. She had not taken off her gloves because of modesty. She took them off now because some promises must be made with skin. The priest, or was he only a man very old, who had agreed to stand with them, began to speak in a northern cadence that made language itself seem carved instead of written. Margaery listened with a new faculty, one she had not known she had been cultivating. The ability to hear words that did not need gold around them to matter. The cloth he held was woven of 2 widths of wool that had been stitched down the center with thread redder than any rose she had worn. He looped it around their hands. The weight surprised her. She had expected something ceremonial and light. This was practical and not delicate at all. It would take use. It would take strain. It would not tear if pulled. "I am yours," John said, and she heard in it no possession, only an offering. He did not say the name that might have lived under his skin. The one that some swore was written in a room with blood and water and a whisper. He said the only name that mattered here, and he said it as if it had both honor and sorrow in it. "You are mine." Margaery had promised herself she would not make a pretty speech. She kept that promise. "I am yours," she said, and then, because she had learned in the ruin of the capital that a vow not anchored in laughter is a vow the world will try to steal. She added very softly, very quickly, so that it sounded like breath and not like bravery. "And I am also my own." John's mouth moved in something that might have been a smile if it had been less careful. "Good," he said. "Keep that." Ghost moved once, a ripple of pale on pale, and settled again. The old man tied a second knot. The red face on the tree seemed to tilt, though of course it did not. Margaery felt as if the wood around them had broadened its shoulders to let them pass as a pair where one would not have fit. She had married before, twice, and both times it had felt like entering a hot room and learning, too late, that the windows had been painted shut. This felt like walking out onto a plain where weather could get at you from any direction, but you could see it coming in each. Olenna sighed, stealthily, in relief she would deny if asked. Sansa's eyes had wet in them that the cold would be proud to pretend it had caused. Davos, she had not noticed him before, which meant he had meant her not to, shifted his weight as if a different kind of burden just found a better place on his back. They drank from a horn that tasted of metal and something animal. Jon's lips were colder than the horn. When it was done, when the cloth had been loosened and kept because keeping mattered, Jon bent his head in a gesture that was not entirely a kiss, and not entirely a bow, and not entirely anything she had seen in a court. It was the motion a man makes when he has accepted both a weather and a command he gave himself. "Highgarden," Olenna said afterwards, in a tone that suggested that by speaking it she created it and not the other way around. "We will go home, and we will make our home different." "Old Town first," Margaery said, looking south through the trees as if the bark held maps. "The high tower keeps its own counsel. We must light it properly." "Bread before bells," Davos said as if to himself. "Send boats ahead of us with a banner sewn to a sail, a wolf and a rose. They'll believe the bread. They'll learn to believe the banner after." Jon nodded. "We ride with a small guard. The rest follow when the roads allow. I'll not strip Winterfell because the South is hungry. I will strip the Reach because it is fat," Olenna said. "It will be leaner and better." Sansa came to Margaery then and took her hands with a Stark's deliberation. "Welcome," she said, as if she were acknowledging weather that had already arrived. "I will send with you a dress lined for southern winters. They are not like ours. They feel kinder until they kill." "I will take the dress," Margaery said, and then, with sudden sincerity that surprised them both, "And I will send you, when I can, the smallest thing, lemons perhaps, if the markets are not too proud to sell them to a house married to wolves." Sansa's mouth did the rare thing. It smiled completely. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." Night came with the quickness of the north, the sky turning from blue china to black iron with very little ceremony. They walked back toward the hall together and then apart. Sansa with Olenna and a tacit treaty between them that looked, from behind, like two women of two worlds making each other less alone. Davos with Tormund, whose laughter did not seem to understand that cold could kill it. Jon with Margaery not touching, because sometimes touch made a promise too loudly and they had already promised enough for one night. The tower room prepared for her had a brazier that worked and a bed with a mattress stuffed with something that had once been alive. She lay on it and listened to the sound of Winterfell sleeping. The long sigh of old timbers, the brief bark of a dog who dreamt of deer, the way her own blood moved in her ears like a tide at a stone quay. When sleep took her, it did not, for once, bring fire. In the morning, the air had a different taste. Less knife, more coin. They set out before the sun had properly admitted defeat. Horses stamped and snorted. Men checked girths with hands that knew leather better than they did their own wives' faces. Margaery mounted, her thighs aching from yesterday's cold. Jon swung into his saddle with unpracticed grace, the kind of balance that looks like a mistake until you realize it is genius refusing to admit itself. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said, and smiled in a way that made it clear that was the right answer. "But I am willing." The gate opened. Winterfell let them go not because it did not want them, but because it understood that walls are only as holy as the roads they lead to. They rode. The south received them with a smell that made Margaery's throat hurt because it remembered a sweetness the cold could not spoil. turned earth even in winter, the ghost of time, the clean metallic note of water moving over stones that had seen too much wine spilled on them to be impressed by any further celebration. Old Town's spire kept the horizon honest. It lifted out of the plain like an idea, and all the ideas gathered toward it because that was what they had been taught to do. John's face in this light was different. He did not glisten like a court-bred jewel. He absorbed. He learned the color of the air and held it, the way a good stone holds heat hours after the fire has gone out. Men watched him from behind hedges or walls or their own eyes. Women watched him openly. Children, with the cruel fairness of children, shouted "Winter," as if he had brought it with him wound around his shoulders. At the first village, they stopped because to ride through without stopping would set the wrong story in men's mouths. The headman approached with a hat in his hands and dignity in the way he did not fidget. He looked at the wolf and the rose banner, at the way they had been stitched not by a maestro herald but by someone practical, and nodded once as if to say, "That is how you make a thing real, with a needle and a patient hand." "We have bread," Margaery said, and when the headman's mouth tightened, "Pride, not misery," she added. "To trade for information. Is the Mander passable for boats yet? Has Lord Hightower sent riders to the outlying farms? Have the Florents tried to take what is not theirs lately? Do the red and green apple fossaways still argue about whose fruit is sweeter?" The headman's mouth eased. He answered in sentences that had been waiting all winter to be asked their opinions. The Mander was navigable in sections. The Hightower had sent not riders but letters, which meant that the letters needed riders to mean anything. The Florents had found piety this season, which meant they were planning theft next, and the Fossaways' feud had gone into hibernation like snakes. "Boats?" Davos murmured aside to John, pencil straight and thinking in rope and wind. "We can get flour upriver if we coax the current as if it were a stubborn mule. Find me a shipwright who's had more love affairs than he's bragged about. They make better decisions." "Old Town," Margaery said, and John nodded. Not permission, not command, but agreement's simplest shape. They came to the city as afternoon rinsed to copper. The Hightower cast a shadow that felt less like darkness than like the shade of a great tree you were grateful for until you remembered what lived in trees. A delegation came out to meet them. Men in tidy cloaks with ink on their fingers. One woman whose body had grown thick with the deep comfort of the South, but whose eyes were sharp as a winter twig. "Lady Margaery," said Lord Leighton's steward, "we are relieved to see you. Rumors have been merchants. The truth is a poor competitor." "Then let us give the truth a better market," Margaery said. "Old Town is not the reach, but it feeds the minds that feed the reach. We will fill both mouths." Lord Leighton Hightower sent them not himself. He was doing something with his windows, which was a phrase that meant as much and as little as it always had. But his son, who had his father's preoccupation with things no one could see and a very real respect for bread. After the first courtesies, they moved into the room that mattered. A hall with a table long enough to make men believe in plans. Maps were unrolled with the ease of men untying shirts. Small stones went on them to hold down corners and to stand for towns and dreams. "The Mander," Davos said, finger following its slow S, "is your spine. Grain from upriver, casks lashed together as rafts. We'll lose some, that's the price. But we can have bread in market squares by the month's turn if weather doesn't break our teeth. On the road," John added, "storehouses, guarded by men who would rather be anywhere else. Pay them enough that they will not cut corners. Let them eat first, so they do not decide to let bandits steal for them." "Bandits?" said the Hightower's son, offended briefly by the idea that men would do crime in the shadow of such a beautiful tower. "Men whose bellies wear their ribs," Margaery said, "or men whose bellies wear their vices. Either one is a bandit if you leave him too long without acknowledgement. Give him a job. Let stealing look like work and he will start to prefer the taste of wages." They spoke hours. The steward's woman took notes clean and pitiless. Outside, the tower's shadow lengthened until it was a sentence across the river. When they rose, no one announced a victory. Those come later, if at all, and are usually private. They only said who would ride and who would stay and where the boats would be found, and which carpenter knew how to ask a tree to grow into a mast even after it had left its roots. Highgarden itself waited like a lover who had kept the house tidy in absence but could not control the dust. Its gates admitted them reluctantly, then with something that might have been relief. The roses on the banners were tired and proud of their fatigue. Men at the postern had stubble that spoke of long watches. The steward who met them, old, with the hands of a man who had poured wine for 3 generations, bowed so slowly Margaery thought for a moment he was falling. "My lady," he said. "My queen." The second title came like the cracking of a thin sheet of ice on a puddle. It was small, but it was a sound. Margaery dismounted and placed her hand on the warm stone of the gate. Home. She had loved and hated it in the way girls do who grow up with beauty for walls. As a mirror, as a prison, as a garden where the paths all led to other people's plans. It smelled of old lemons and thyme and linen beaten clean by women who would die believing in the world they had made with their hands and who were right to. Jon waited for her to move. The hall, her hall, opened itself. She walked forward and heard, behind her, the measured fall of his boots. There was work waiting here that would be joy because it was purpose. She would change the kitchens so that bread went out each morning with a clerk's list of which houses had paid and which had promised to. She would open a small room on the 3rd floor to sun and let women meet there without asking permission, because a kingdom is made or unmade most days by women and the tables they set. She would cut 2 banners into one. She would ask the old gods to sit under olive trees and the 7 to walk, once in snow. Later, much later, after the steward had shown them where the wells still ran sweet and the guard captain who had kept boys in line with the back of his hand had been told he could keep his hand if he learned a gentler way, after she had walked the balcony that looked down into the rose maze and felt, briefly, the strange grief that comes when you stand at the center of something you have long chased and find that you had wanted not the thing but the running, she found Jon alone in a courtyard, lit by lanterns set into niches. He stood with head back, looking up not at the lanterns but at the small blade of moon. "In the north," she said. "You have a better moon." "The same moon," he said without looking away. "We just have fewer excuses not to see it." "Do you like it here?" she asked. He lowered his chin and considered. "I like what you'll make of it," he said. "I like that your people will like what you make. I like that when winter comes this far south, they'll be ready because you told them it was possible." "You help me," she said. It was not a question. "We will do it together." "Together," he said. In the dark between lanterns, something moved. Not danger, a vine remembering summer. Margaery shivered and could not name whether it was cold or Luck's hand on her back. "The lions will come," she said quietly. "Yes," Jon said. "And the dragon." "Perhaps," he said. "If she believes she can set the world right by burning it straight." "What do you believe?" He listened to the night until it spoke sense. "That fire is a good servant and a bad master," he said. "And that bread buys more oaths than flame." She laughed then, out of exhaustion and the joy of hearing a sentence she would have stitched on a banner if banners could bear something other than beasts. "Lord Bread," she said. "They will call you that secretly. And they will be right. They'll call you something sharper," he said. And this time he did smile. A small, true thing that altered his face the way a warm wind alters the surface of cold water. "And they'll be afraid of how right they are." She reached for his hand. It found hers as if it had been moving toward it without his knowledge all day. The lanterns cracked a little in their metal skins. Somewhere above them, a raven took wing, and the sound of it beating the air became an omen only if you needed it to be. They stood and did not ask the night to be kind. They asked it to be honest. And it was. The keys took the day and made a use of it. Men with backworn strength walked bent as if the sun itself were a bale they carried from ship to shore. Barrels knocked softly together with the wooden, conversational thud of things that understood their work. Davos stood at a trestle table, the ledger open like a captain's heart, and wrote. His script was what a tide would look like if it learned letters, logic in waves. A boatman in a coat patched with sailcloth spat into the river, judged its drift, and nodded with a field marshal's seriousness. Everything here had rank, even spit. 200 weight per raft, no more? Davos said, kneeling to put his palm against a plank as if listening for the tree still inside it. We're building luck out of wood and guesses. Don't insult either. A boy had come to stand beside Margaery without her noticing. He had his cap in his hands and his fear in his throat, and he held both with equal care. My mam's got a marker, he said, the words told to him by his mother and now told again by him as if they were herbs tied with string. Fragile but useful. She says the city scribe marked us for 3 loaves a week and a quart of oats. But the man at the booth says the mark's wrong. Margaery crouched so her eyes were level with his. When you bend, people straighten. Where is your mother? She asked. He pointed, and there she was, one of the market women by the sacks, her palms flower-paled, her eyes so tired that if the day offered to carry them for an hour she would have let it. Margaery went. The woman held out the strip of stiff paper the Citadel clerk had inked yesterday. A tidy set of lines and numbers and a name written as if the scribe did not entirely trust names to stay where they were placed. Your Grace, the woman said, and the title came out half apology, half defiance. Your marker is good, Margaery said after reading, and when she looked up her smile was small and pointed. The man at the booth has made the mistake. We will fix the man. Jon was listening to a fisherman talk about the Lodge of Currents where the mander thickened on its own thought. The fisherman had hair the color of twine and eyes that did not ask kings for permission to teach them things. There's a seam, he said, drawing the line with a wet finger on the side of his boat. Here, run your raft like a needle along it, and you'll make the turn without your barrels wanting to be private about their plans. Jon nodded his thanks and set a double coin on the boat's worn bench. The fisherman pushed it back, then let it stay after he'd pushed it back twice more, and the king would not be instructed in how not to be generous. Do it again for the next boatman, the man said. Then we'll both be the kind of fools who make sense. At the booth, a steward had affixed himself like a barnacle to authority. He had a quill behind his ear and a way of saying no that suggested he had been ill-used by the word yes as a boy. Margaery set the marker on the board, set her hand lightly atop it, and spoke low. She did not make a public hanging of him. She made a private bridge instead. We will be precise, she said. You will be paid to be precise. You will be praised to be precise. And you will be corrected if your precision depends upon the face that asks for it. He opened his mouth twice, either to protest or to turn to salt, and then gave a little bow that was only partly a collapse. Yes, my lady. Bring his ration yourself, Margaery added, and the steward went, and she watched the boy watch him, and decided the world might stay mended one more day. Davos found Jon with a bundle of lengths of dyed yarn in his hand. Signals, he said, lifting them as if they were fish. Blue for flood, red for low, black for don't be a fool. The river talks, but I'll not trust every man here to hear it. Flags tell truth in wind. We should teach them the river anyway, Jon said. He had liked the fisherman's hands. They had reminded him of Ed's, of Benjen's, of a boy at the wall who had learned to turn his fear into a rope and knot it. We will, Davos said, and smiled with his splinter of humor. And in the meantime we'll cheat. By noon, the first rafts were bound, the casks not roped but netted, the netting knotted by a woman with a scar on her cheek that looked like a silverfish. You pull here, she told a lad who had already begun to imagine himself the hero of his day, and you'll have an accident. You pull here and you'll have a story. You choose which you can afford. Jon walked among them like a hillside does, steady, present, without demanding notice. Margaery moved like water, finding what was low and filling it. When a baker's wife asked whether the marker would be accepted at the south gate when the north gate clerk had stamped it with a north gate stamp, Margaery sent a runner to fetch both gatekeepers and made them look at each other's hands. You serve one city, she said, and they nodded, embarrassed into utility. A bell told the hour. It was a practical sound, not a summons. The high tower threw its shadow like a lance across the river, and the lance moved slow with the sun, touching first the rafts and then the faces on the quay as if knighting them for a work more holy than war. Good, Davos said, closing the ledger. Now we just have to do it again until it looks easy. Make it look easy, Margaery said quietly, and no one will thank you. Then put the thanks somewhere bread can use it, he said. Don't spend it on ears. Jon, watching a boy take his first place on a pole, thought suddenly of a courtyard with straw on the ground and a wooden sword in his hands, and Robb laughing because a splinter had flown, not because anyone was hurt. He let the memory steady him and then stored it back where it could not be knocked from its shelf by rough news. The first raft moved. It did not look brave. That was its strength. It simply left. The library smelled of leather, old breath, and knowledge the way a forge smells of iron and sweat. The hush was not imposed. It grew on you, the way the shade from a tree you respected grows on your neck at noon. When Jon crossed the threshold, he felt his shoulders remember a boy's shape. He had never lived among books, but he had lived among men who had told him that words were tools, and this room was the cart shed where they were stored well and sharpened badly. Sam looked up and the world did a small, private thing that it should do more often. It made sense. Joy moved across Sam's face as unguarded as light across water. He stood with none of the self-consciousness that had once governed even his standing, and his arms went out because his heart had. Jon, he said, and said it again because sometimes names need saying twice to settle. They embraced. Jon smelled ink on Sam's collar and old dust in his hair and decided they were honest sense and welcome. You're thinner, Jon said, mock accusatory. And you're alive, Sam said, not mock at all, and dabbed at his eyes with a corner of his sleeve as if tears were an ink he meant to conserve. Davos leaned on a pillar because it resembled a mast and so made him comfortable. Margaery stood a pace behind Jon, watching the reunion with the mixed ache and relief of someone who has spent many hours making strangers into allies and is, for once, allowed to see that some alliances carry themselves. We've been writing letters, Sam told them, stacking a volume with the cautious care of a man who knows how much weight looks like nothing at all. About what's to come. I know how that sounds here. He glanced at the near table where an older maester scratched a note with a pen that had a grudging relationship with the ink it used. But it's not a story when you've seen it. We need the Citadel to send ravens without argument, Margaery said. About bread, and about death that isn't content to stay where it was put. Maester Abrose, a man whose cheeks were the color of old clay and whose mind was good at finding the sliver between useful and nonsense, lifted his head just enough to show he was listening. We already send ravens about bread, he said. As for the other rumor with footprints, Sam said, and the tremble that had once lived in his voice now lived in the content of his words instead. The sound itself was sure. I went north of the wall. I stood where maps fray. There are things there that wear men like coats. There are things there that hate heat. There are things there that do not care that Old Town takes its ale by the quart and not the pint. Abrose made a small noise that might have been the beginning of a cough or the end of an objection. What do you propose, Lord Snow? King, Davos said, not out of ceremony but to keep the conversation honest. King in the north. Abrose said, because titles were puzzles and he was a man who liked pieces that stayed where he placed them. Very well. What do you propose, your grace? 2 things, Jon said. One that you can do without asking your ghosts for permission. One that you can do only if you stop treating knowledge as if it is a hoard. Abrose's mouth did a thing it did when he met a thought that offended and intrigued him both. Proceed. Send ravens to every holdfast south of the neck with a list of the storehouses along the Mander, how much grain is in each, and who is authorized to draw from them. Include a seal and a cipher that a gatekeep can read. People die when a clerk enjoys his doubts too much. And the second? Open your books about the long night, Jon said. Not to me, to anyone who can read. Let the Septons copy them and sing them if they like. Let the hedge witches read them aloud by their fires. Let millers teach their daughters the parts about keeping warm and together. You know these things as stories. I know them as weather. Abrose pursed his lips. Book learning in the mouths of the small folk becomes superstition in a day. And superstition becomes sense, Margaery said softly. When you put bread under it, Tell them it is coming. Then feed them where you can. Men who are fed will sit and listen even if what they hear sounds like a story at first. We guard knowledge, Ibros said, almost plaintive. You garden it, Margaery corrected, and watched his eyes flick as if she had reminded him of a metaphor he had liked as a boy. This is a season when you must scatter seed and let it fall where it would not be allowed in a tidier spring. Sam had been rummaging among his papers, and now he straightened, triumph and embarrassment mixed. I wrote something, he said, holding out a page with lines neat as fence rails. Plain speech, about what to do if dead things move in the snow. It is not pretty. Jon took it and read. The words were blunt objects and would hold a door if pressed against it. This will help, he said, if it is read. It will be, Margaery said. I will see to it that it is read in markets between the prices and the gossip. We will make the truth feel at home where truth is usually a poor guest. Ibros leaned back and let the lantern light tell him what his eyes did not wish to admit. That there were people here who would do this whether he approved or not, and that his approval would make it safer. We will copy it, he said. We will affix seals you can trust. We will dispatch the ravens. And if we are mocked in the courts as country midwives, we will endure it because the courts are as temporary as this winter sun. Thank you, Sam said, and it mattered that he said it, and it mattered that Ibros inclined his head, acknowledging that thanks were not simply niceties, but the coins that let work continue. Your father, Jon said to Sam when Ibros had drifted away like an idea that had somewhere else to be. Is he with us?
Sam swallowed.
No, he knew the word in his bones and had learned to speak it without apology. Not yet. He is with whoever he thinks will win. He believes in winning. He believes in blood that runs straight and in a world that can be arranged with a sword and a ledger. He is not wrong about the ledger, a ghost of a smile at Davos. But he believes it should be his handwriting, always. Will he come when called? Margaery asked. If the call is a challenge, Sam said. If he can see a hill with a banner at its top and a reason to take it. He looked at Jon, affection and fear both. You are a reason. Then let's give him a hill, Davos said, tapping the edge of the map. Not a battlefield. A parley ground where a man can be seen saying yes and keep his pride from going home with a limp. Bitterbridge had been named for a taste that lingered in men's mouths when they crossed its span and discovered that on the other side of the river lay the piece of work they'd hoped someone else would do. The hill beyond it was not tall, but it was honest. It rose just enough to let a man look down and think himself perspective's master. Banners ran their colors through the wind. The wolf and the rose both looked as if they had been made by hands that understood banners were not poems. They were declarations written for rain. Randyll Tarly rode up like a conclusion looking for a premise. His beard was clipped to fit under a helmet snug as a judgment. He dismounted with the precision of a man who had drilled his own body until it obeyed him without conversation. His men arranged themselves to be sure and visible both. Lady Margaery, he said first, because even when you give offense you begin where the world expects you to. You were lost to us. Then I am found, she said, not flippant. She held his regard the way a seamstress holds a needle. Not fearfully, not idly, with purpose. Lord Tarly. He turned to Jon and measured him as if he were a horse being considered for purchase. King, he said, and did not inflect the word with anything a boy could hear and call an insult, but a man could. In the north, Jon said, and here as a husband to the lady of these lands. Randyll's jaw moved once and stopped. A bastard's ambition grows strange fruit in winter. Sam's face rose in Jon's mind like a lantern lit on a dark beach. He answered with the calm that had once allowed him to stand before men who called him traitor and listen until their throats gave out. I do not carry ambition here, he said. I carry bread. Bread is politics, Randyll said. Ask a hungry man who votes with his hands. Then let his vote buy him another day, Margaery said. And let us collect days until we have a year and then a kingdom that remembers who ensured it 8. Tarly looked at her with the wary admiration soldiers sometimes cultivate for queens who do not think their smiles are weapons. You would ally with the North, he said. Against whom? The Lannister who claims the throne and sends wagons west to starve us? Or the dragon girl blowing ash ahead of her like a child with a dandelion? Against winter, Jon said. Against hunger. Against the dead. And against lions who will use any of those to keep their chairs. Olenna had arrived as silently as a knife placed in shadow on a table. She stood at Margaery's shoulder and did not ask permission to speak in a ring of men. Choose, Randall. Choose the living. They pay their debts in the currency of grandchildren. He stiffened at her name like a hound catching scent of an old fox. Lady Olenna, you terrify boys into walking straight, she said with genuine approval. Now terrify yourself into the same. He laughed once, unwilling and grateful. What do you ask? Neutrality, Jon said, before the word could be mistaken for cowardice. Do not march for the Lannisters. Do not march for the dragon. March your men to field granaries and to the roads and teach them to keep their oaths more complicated than kill and live. When the dead come, march where I tell you. You command much. I ask for what the world requires, Jon said, which is less than what kings usually do and more than men think they can give until they have to. Randall paced 2 lengths and became the line his pacing drew. Your father, he said to Margaery without looking at her, was a fool, a generous fool, an amiable fool, a fool who confused feasts with policy and string music with promises. But he kept his lands fat. I will not watch them be made thin by a girl's grief or a northerner's fables. Margaery did not let heat rise to answer him. She extended her arm, bare at the wrist where the glove had been peeled back, and displayed the red dent the godswood cloth had left on her months ago and still left when she worked too long with her hands. This is my grief, she said. This mark and this plan. She gestured, and from below the hill unfurled the sight of wagons at their work. Barrels rolled and stamped with the Hightower seal. Markers passed between women whose aprons were clean because they had made them so, not because the world stayed tidy for them. If I were dumb with sorrow, you would be justified in replacing me. I am not dumb, nor am I a fable, Jon said. I died once. That is not a rumor. It is a thing that happened. And while I do not recommend it, it taught me that the rules men use to keep themselves comfortable are not the rules the world uses to keep itself turning. Tarly's eyes flicked, despite himself, to Jon's throat as if looking for a scar to argue with. He found nothing to comfort him. He spat, not in contempt, but in the way soldiers do when the taste in their mouth reminds them of rust. Neutrality, he said again, testing the word for weakness. And grain stores under your men's watch, Margaery said, and a seat at every council we hold in the Reach. I will not shut you out of decisions and then ask you to enforce them. He looked at her long enough to see the steel set under the velvet. I want tithe rights on the westbound road. You may have steward rights, Margaery said, not theft rights. You will keep accounts that would make the stranger himself weep with boredom. And you will hand them to me when the month is done. Randall's mouth quirked, and the expression almost made him a father. Lady Melessa keeps the accounts, he said. You will prefer them to mine. Then she will hand them to me, Margaery said, and saw in the small flare in his eyes the one tender place that even his armor could not shield. And I will thank her properly. He bowed, not so low that he forgot who he was, but low enough to say yes. Neutrality, he said, until the dead come. And then, Jon asked. Then, Randall said, and showed his teeth in something that was not friendly but was clean. I will be glad I trained my men to do what I tell them. I will bring Heartsbane and whatever faith I have left, and we will see if either still cut. They called it a sewing room because men liked to believe that when women gathered there was a predictable product at the end, preferably something that could be worn. It had once been a room for embroidery, for hemming things already made, for making the pretty prettier and the useful polite. Margaery opened the shutters and the ledgers and the air. The loom sang a little when the wind found it. On the table were stacked not silk but lists. Who had what? Who owed what? Who had given what he could not afford and must be repaid when the fields forgave them? Olena's needle went in and out with the steady hate of a woman who refuses to let fabric fray in her presence. If men could count without boasting about it, this room would not be necessary, she said, not unkindly but with the resignation of a gardener who knows how often she will be weeding. We will keep 2 books, Margaery told the room. One for the realm and one for ourselves. Murmur, not to hide, to remember. The official ledger is what men see when they come to collect taxes or praise themselves for sending help. The other is the truth. The boy who lost his father to a cart axle and needs 2 loaves more than the book allows. The widow who will pay in seeds she has saved in a jar no one else knows to look for. A steward's wife, gray-haired and suspicious of any queen who had not yet proven that her feet could find the kitchen without guidance, lifted her chin. You keep that book and you keep us safe when the other is read by eyes that like to punish. I will, Margaery said, and she would. And when the other is read by eyes that like to use our work as their own crown, I will let them. I am not too proud to see a stolen credit buy us a quieter day. Jon paused at the threshold when he saw what the room was. A hall of power with its hair braided and its skirt tucked up so it would not trip on the stairs. He learned, as quickly as he had learned to listen to snow, that the best thing a man can do in such a room is hold a pitcher and pour when a hand is empty. So he did. He poured water that tasted faintly of lemon in winter, and he stood as if he were a brother helping sisters and not a king inspecting servants. And the women saw him and decided they would decide later what to make of him. For now, he was useful and that was enough. Olenna watched him from under lashes that had the memory of girlhood in them. If you continue to behave like furniture that improves the room, she said, I shall have to reevaluate my opinion of northern men. We would not wish that on you, Jon said, and she let the corner of her mouth consider upturning. When the women had gone, some to the wells, some to beds they had remade in their minds while working because remaking beds is how women prepare to sleep, the room cooled. Margaery closed the ledger and rubbed the bridge of her nose where numbers sometimes lodged like grit. You keep faith like a spinner keeps thread, Jon said. No one sees it until it snags, and then they are furious and grateful by turns. I learned in King's Landing to make my work look like a decoration, she said. I am unlearning it. She set the ledger aside and walked to the open arch. The night outside was a rich dark, the kind that reminded you that darkness isn't empty. It's full of things that have decided not to announce themselves. Tommen, she said, and the name stepped into the room and stood where the light was neither kind nor cruel. He would have liked this. He was a boy who believed that goodness worked if you set it carefully on a table and did not let anyone jostle it. He trusted me to keep the table from being jostled. I failed. A beat. We both did. You kept him from becoming cruel, Jon said. Sometimes that is a victory that has to live without witnesses. I will be a witness for it, she said, and for other small victories no one wants to count. She turned, and for a moment the woman the realm wanted, a rose on a banner, was not in the room. Only Margaery was, with her wrists and the red trace on one of them and the look of someone who had decided that a plan is better than a prayer because plans can include prayers and prayers rarely include plans. Are you afraid of me? She asked him without a smile, because she was tired of using one to soften a thing that did not need softening. Yes, he said, not that you will harm me, that you will be harmed and I will call it duty. She let that sit. Then do not, she said. Call it what it is when it is upon us. And when it is not, call it something gentler so we will remember why we serve it. He stepped closer. The godswood cloth had left its wheel on his wrist once as well. He wore it in memory when he pulled on gloves. I will try, he said, the only honest vow a man can make about the future. When he left, she stayed at the arch until the lanterns guttered and a bird began to consider the idea of mourning. The arbor smelled of 100 harvests stored in oak. The red wine ships lay at anchor like cats at rest. Sleek, ready, uninterested in your opinion about their grace. Paxter Redwine was a man made of courtesy and cunning in the comfortable ratio that keeps islands prosperous. He spread a chart on a barrel and held its corners with 4 iron cleats shaped like grapes because even the shipwright's jokes were competent here. The sea will be kinder than the road to your grain, he said. If the wind agrees not to be a bastard. He glanced at Davos with the private fellowship of men who had both argued with wind and convinced it to apologize later. We can run to White Harbor and back twice with half the trouble of your river play, and twice the threat from men who would like to make a feast of your holds, Davos said. Euron, said Paxter, the name leaving his mouth like something you spit to keep from swallowing. And lions with boats borrowed from friends who prefer to be paid in promises. He tapped the chart. We will cut south of the Shield Islands when we must, but to White Harbor we go straight. Jon set a finger on the map where White Harbor fanned into its arms like a mother receiving a child she had thought lost. Wyman Manderley will receive you in person if he can fit his person into a boat. Affection warmed the joke. He will send back what we need and more than that, favors. We will load flour, Margaery said, and we will load letters. She looked at Paxter and then at Davos. Letters to wives in the north who do not often receive such news of their husband's pay and their good behavior and the kindling that will be delivered next week if the ice relents. Let them see that a southern hand can carry a northern message without dropping it. Paxter's smile slid sideways in the way of a man who has just been given an advantage that also improves the world. My lady, your politics will be the death of slander. Slender, Davos muttered, correcting under his breath, because if you are going to pun, you should at least sew the seams straight. They walked the pier while men swarmed the rigging. Davos explained to a carpenter how to shave a tiller to keep a helmsman's palm safe from blisters on a long watch. Jon listened to the particular music of a ship, the tick of tar, the creak of rope, the gull's mockery and benediction both. Margaery spoke to a woman who sat mending a net on the low stone wall and had a baby at her breast and a knife at her belt. If a ship comes in red-sailed without our device, you take your baby inside and bar the door, Margaery said. If a man knocks and says he is a king's man, you tell him to say which king. If he says one with a chair in King's Landing, you ask him whether he brought you bread or only news. If it is only news, you do not open. The woman laughed because it was the laugh that women use when someone has just respected their common sense. Aye, my lady. They loaded. The sea took their plan into itself, the way seas do when men give them offerings of wood and hope. White Harbor would see sails with a device no one had seen before. A wolf and a rose sharing one wind. Wyman would make a speech that sounded like appetite and was. Men in the north would eat bread made from grain milled by men who had never seen snow. The first convoy sailed at dusk, when the water forgot for a moment whether it preferred to be steel or silk. Davos stood at the stern and took off his glove and dipped his fingers in the sea, then touched those wet fingers to his brow. Luck, he said to the god of everything that moves and to the ghosts of men he had known when he was shorter, poorer, and happier without knowing it. Jon put a hand on his shoulder. When they return, he said. They will, Davos said, not as a prayer but as an instruction to the world. Sometimes the world responds better if you give it orders softly. The barn had been built for hay and laughter. Today it held sacks of flour and the kind of silence that comes when men are deciding what sort of men they intend to be. A boy lay under a tarp because someone had had the mercy to give him a covering. His shoes stuck out dumbly like punctuation not yet assigned to a sentence. 3 men backed themselves to a wall with knives that would have been happier slicing bread. Their eyes flicked. Exits, guards, the queen, the king. Not queen and king, no. Woman you could appeal to and man you could maybe kill. Stop, Margaery said, and a guard's step obeyed her. She looked at the men. Their faces carried months of thinness but not years of cruelty. What do you think we will do to you? Hang us? One said, and the word hung itself in the rafters and swung there, making all the beams look thinner. What would it buy? Jon asked. What would it teach? Other than that the hungry should keep their hands clean while they starve. You'll do it anyway, another said. A man with a scar on his lip that gave every word he used the shape of something bitten. Because the dead boy demands a trade. Margaery stepped closer until she could smell their fear, which smelled like any sweat and so reminded her of the small bothering truth that fear lives in a body the same way joy does, with no more ceremony. "We will find his name," she said. "We will find his mother. We will give her bread enough to live through the month and someone to sit with her while she remembers how to speak. And then we will do this." She turned to the crowd. Husbandman, a butcher, 5 children with eyes the size of copper coins, 2 dogs. "These men wanted grain," she said. "They took without asking, and they took poorly, damning themselves to spend the rest of the season looking over their shoulders. We will show them a better theft. You will take them. Murmur, by the collar, by the ear, by the work. You will make them your debtors. They will carry twice what any man carries for the next 30 days. They will eat last. They will not sleep where wine is. They will not see their mothers unless they have earned a visit. And when the month is done, if they have done what was asked, you will not call them thieves. You will call them by their names again. And if they don't?" asked the butcher, who had never had time for philosophy and had learned that most mercy curdled if you did not stir it. "Then we hang them," John said, not cold, not kind, simply placing the hook in the right beam of the barn so that everyone could see where it was if they needed it later. He looked at the men. "If you run, my men will catch you. If you fight, my men will hurt you. If you work, you will become useful before you become ghosts. Decide." The man with the bitten lip looked at the dead boy's shoes and then, very slowly, as if it cost him a finger at a time, set his knife down. The second followed. The third held a heartbeat longer out of habit, then 2. A woman in the crowd who had until this moment looked prepared to despise all outcomes put her hand over her mouth and lowered it again. Not a sob, not a laugh, a readjustment. "Your name?" Margaery asked the first. "Harlan. Harlan. This is my steward." She gestured to the stern-faced woman at her side, whose joy in filling a room with order was so exact that even chaos felt flattered to be corrected by her. "You will sleep behind the barn on straw. You will wake before light. You will carry. If you give trouble, she will show you a kindness you will not like." "I know kinds," Harlan muttered, but the mutter had lost its teeth. They lifted the tarp and set the dead boy on a door taken from its hinges. His name was Bram. He had a cowlick that would have sprung up sweetly on a summer morning had he been allowed to have one. John walked beside the door as if Bram were a fallen brother, because the word has a larger meaning than arms around shoulders in a hall. Margaery walked with the mother. 2 women bore the weight of each other's breath, which is sometimes the only weight one can carry without breaking. When it was done, when bread had been measured, when the barn felt a degree less like a place where men go to make bad choices and a degree more like a place where they go to be forgiven for them, a Lannister envoy rode into the yard with red cloak lifted to his nose against the smell of work. "Her Grace of King's Landing," he announced loudly enough that the rats would carry the message to their queen. "Requires that all Tyrell lands recognize her sovereign claim and remit 1/10 of their stores against the coming winter and for the relief of the capital." "Which sovereign claim?" Margaery asked, voice gentle, "because sometimes you manage men best by making them argue with your grammar." "The sovereign claim," the envoy said, and his horse shifted under a man who was unused to living between 2 kinds of certainty. "Relief," Margaery repeated, tasting the word. "We will send lemons because we are kind." There was a ripple of wonder at the word. Lemons? Summer? Queens? A perfume of a world that had not learned about wildfire. "We will send salted fish because we are practical. We will not send grain. We are using it." The envoy straightened. "The queen will take offense. Then she will have something to warm her," Olenna said, having appeared like a thorn working itself to daylight through a silk cushion. "It gets cold in that tower of hers when the only fire is hatred. You are in rebellion," the envoy tried, and the sentence stumbled over the sight of the dead boy being carried past the barn door and became something less grand and more foolish. "We are in winter," John said. "Tell her that if she wishes to be queen of anything worth ruling in spring, she will learn how to say please." The envoy's mouth opened, shut, opened again. He was a man used to being the blade his mistress sent across the map to draw blood at a distance. He had landed in a room that had learned to fight with bread and found his edge was not designed for such work. He wheeled his horse and rode away because some news needs to be delivered while it is still warm. The maze had been meant as a joke by some lord with too much time and too many gardeners. Look, here is love made difficult. If you wish to find the center, earn it. Margaery knew all its turns. She had learned them as a girl by listening to the birds and the way their songs changed when you neared the heart. Tonight the birds were quiet and the roses were sleeves of ice. She walked without fear of thorns because she needed the reminders on her fingertips that living things defend themselves when they must. She came upon the fountain, and it was one of those mercies the world grants when it has made up its mind not to be petty. It was not frozen. It made a sound like silk shaken out. The lantern's light knelt on its rim and begged for reflection and was granted it. Jon stepped through a side arch and did not startle her because he had never moved like a man who arrived where he did not belong. They stood on opposite sides of the basin with the water between them, and it made of them a diptych. Two halves of a thing that would always and only be itself when set together. "Do you regret it?" Margaery asked. "Leaving your house to come to mine?" "No," he said. "Sometimes I worry I am learning the wrong lessons too quickly." He smiled, a small thing that warmed the air around it. "I never knew how many kinds of bread there are." "There are many kinds of everything," she said. "Bread, grief, joy, loyalty, even love." He looked at the water to be sure his face was behaving. "We married for bread. And for winter," she said. "And for a plan. And because I liked your eyes and you liked the way I do not let the room make me prettier than I am." She let the smile show then, the one that had once been a coin she spent to buy compliance in a city built on misery. Here it was just a mouth remembering how to be kind to itself. "And because I thought, if I put my hand into this man's, I will not lose it." "You won't," he said. "If I am made to choose between your hand and a war, I will try to choose a cunning that lets us keep both." "You are allowed to fail," she said. And he looked up at that, surprised and grateful and a little ashamed because the permission sounded like the water. "I do not want a perfect king. I want a true husband." He walked around the basin because some words require less distance between mouths to land safely. When he stood near, the lantern's breath made their shadows tilt and kiss before they did. "I don't know how to love in a hall," he said. "I know how to do it in snow. I know how to keep someone warm with my own heat and to watch the wind's tricks and to listen for the sky changing its mind." He searched her face, not romantic but faithful. "Teach me how to do it in stone." "Stand," she said, soft command, a kind of prayer. He stood. She set her palm to his cheek, and the bristle there pleased her because softness that never meets its opposite does not know itself. "Listen," she said, "not to me, to what we built today, to the women counting, to the men pushing poles, to the baker's wife whose hands are cracking with flour and whose husband is learning to carry in a new way. Let that be the noise in your head when you are afraid." He closed his eyes and did as he was told and found, under the crackle of lanterns, under the long whisper of rose canes icing themselves, a sound like breath moving through a sleeping house where everyone had eaten. When he opened his eyes, he kissed her. It was not a victory. It was not a bargain. It was a fact like winter. They stood with their foreheads together while the maze held the night away and the fountain made its case for continuance. She thought of the girl she had been, and of the woman she would have to be to convince men that being fed is not a shame. He thought of ghosts somewhere north, of Sansa under her gray crown of carefulness, of the heart tree's face and the way it seemed sometimes to tilt when your honesty was large enough to be seen by old wood. "We will sleep," she said eventually, practical as kindling. "We will rise. We will count. We will write letters to queens and cousins and carpenters. We will teach the world to eat in a way that makes it harder to kill. And to kill when it must," he said, "because men who pretend that day never comes lay traps for the kind of men who do not pretend." She nodded. "And to kill when it must." They left the maze together by a path that would have taken a stranger an hour and them only 3 minutes. The envoy had found words on the road and brought them back like poor gifts wrapped in better paper. He stood in the hall and spoke of fealty, as if it were a game of cups and balls and Highgarden the crowd to be amused. Olenna let him finish because politeness keeps a hall from learning the wrong habits. When he was done, she held up a hand that had once weighed babies and now weighed outcomes. "You will tell your queen," she said, crisp as a frost that does its work without apology, "that the Reach remembers her gratitude poorly and her debts well. We will send her lemons and fish. We will send her the names of 7 girls who can read numbers better than the men she pays to, and she may hire them if she has decided finally that competence sits where it sits, not where a lord wishes to place it. We will not send grain. If she wants 1/10 of our stores, she may send 1/10 of her soldiers to guard our roads." The envoy swallowed the word insolence. He chose the word danger instead. "King's Landing is not without friends." "No place is," John said. "The question is whether a place is also without bread. Answer that question before you write your letters." Randall stepped briefly out of shadow, as if the work of being neutral required that from time to time he be seen nodding at the right sentence. The envoy saw him and recalculated the angles of his courage. "Very well," he said. "Her Grace will be disappointed." "Not for the first time," Olenna said and smiled. An old woman's last present to a young man who had chosen a career carrying other people's bad news. A joke that would not ruin him to repeat. When he was gone, when the hall let out that breath rooms let out when a danger has been evaluated and found to be only a problem, Margaery turned to the steward and said, "Write to White Harbor. Send the first lemons. Add a note for Lady Sansa." She did not say what the note would contain, only that there would be one. And the steward nodded, already choosing the pen and the ink and the words that would keep their promise all the way north. "War," Randall said. "Not a prediction, a weather report. You will not put it off forever with kindness." "No," Margaery said, "but we will make it ashamed to arrive with hungry men behind it." John thought of a field under moonlight, of men who had gone down under his hand and had left warm blood on cold ground. He thought of how quickly men chisel their grief into monuments and forget to bring a loaf to the widow before they go to look at them. "We will put it off as long as there is bread to move," he said. "And when it comes, we will have done our sums first." Olenna's needle clicked in the pocket where she had tucked it. "Do your sums, children," she murmured, not unloving. "Do them faster than your enemies do theirs." The hall turned to its other work. The small litigations of life in a kingdom that refused to pretend it was anything other than a house with too many rooms and a surprising number of occupants who wished to be clean, warm, and unbothered by lions. At White Harbor, men remembered that the sea is an ally when it has a reason to be. Redwine sailors learned the names of streets that their fathers only knew as marks on an invoice. Wyman Manderley came to the quay with his hat as large as his generosity and clapped sailors on the shoulder until their coats remembered they were cloth and not honor. "Bread," he boomed, and when he said it, it sounded like a cathedral being saved from a fire. A girl who had never seen a lemon looked at one in her palm as if it would whisper. "It's heavy," she said, and a boy next to her said, "That's because it knows stories." And their mother said, "It's because it's fruit," and took it to put atop a cupboard like a small son to be owned until it was consumed. In the Ravenry, scrolls were tied and untied, seals warmed and pressed. Sam's letter about the dead went out a dozen times in a dozen hands. A septon reading it in a voice that had learned to sing births and deaths and could sing other things too. A hedge witch adding a note in the margin about keeping salt near the door because everyone has a charm that helps them say yes to the truth when it comes in a hug they are not ready for. A lord who thought the letter foolish and posted it anyway because he had learned to fear being wrong more than he liked being right. Davos watched the unloading with his hands behind his back so he would not take rope from a boy who needed to learn how to handle it. He counted because he trusted numbers to be the only magic that has never required prayers. Beside him stood a woman in a shawl with a grid of sequins on it that caught the light and turned it into a quiet festival. "My man's on that ship," she said, not pointing. "How long?" Davos asked. 2 years, she said. "A year of them together and a year of them leaning on each other." She squinted into the wintry glare. "He'll have new hands. The sea makes new hands." A beat. "I'll like them." Davos nodded because he knew about hands. "When he touches your door latch," he said, "you'll know him before you see him." She blinked once to carry that truth inside where it could keep its heat. "Aye." From Highgarden came letters, and from Winterfell came a small box with lemons that had sat a day in snow, so they would be cold to the hand when Sansa lifted them. She did, and their smell rose up like news of a country where winter is something telling you to take a shawl, not a plan to unmake you. She wrote back, careful words that were steel inside velvet. She kept one lemon on her desk. When the day had gone badly, she cut a small slice and put it on her tongue and reminded herself that queens can borrow summers. In the solar, the light lay over the table as if it, too, wished to read. Margaery had her hair in a knot that meant she would not be bothered by strands while she did numbers. Jon had removed his sword not to be courteous, but to avoid the weight that would pull his back in a direction other than the one his thoughts needed to go. Olenna warmed her hands and her tongue at the same fire and gave advice that sounded like insults until you listened to the grammar. Red wine runs the sea, Davos said. A shell lodged in his voice that he had never bothered to cough up. Tarly mines the roads. Hightower watches the horizon and tells us what shape the storms like to think they are. We need one more column to keep this roof up. Faith, Margaery said, not piously. Not the faith. Faith. She tapped the second ledger. We must make men believe this is not temporary kindness. If it feels like a favor, they will thank us and go back to the old rules the first chance their bellies give them. We must make it policy. How? Jon asked, honest, interested. By making it boring, she said. And Olenna laughed, delighted by the cruelty of usefulness. By writing it down in the same hand we use to write tithes. By repeating it until even our enemies begin to assume we will arrive to feed them when the wagon wheel breaks. Feed enemies? Randall muttered from his corner, caught between being offended and impressed. You will make them depend on you. Yes, she said, and you will make them sign their names to that dependence. And then, when the day comes that we must ask them to march, they will march because men prefer to keep the world they have grown used to, and we will have made that world gentler. Jon's lips moved around a thought until it was shaped well enough to be said. We'll be asked, he said, by the dragon, by the lion. They will send their hands with paper and their mouths with threats and their eyes with numbers. We cannot ignore them forever. No, Margaery said. We can answer them as we answered hunger, with terms. Dragons do not like terms, Olenna said. Lions pretend to. Then we will send each what they understand, Margaery said. The dragon a list of bridges she must not burn if she wants to rule something livable. The lion a letter strapped to the back of a convoy that will not stop when he tries to count it with soldiers. Jon looked at her, at the line of her mouth and the faithful exhaustion that crept into her shoulders in the 12th hour of the day. He thought of snow on furs and then of lemons on a desk and decided that both were weather and both could be survived if they were named and planned for. They worked until the fire settled into its low, steady voice. They spoke of gates and gatesmen, of ravens, of a monk at a minor sept who had invented a way of counting that would let illiterate women track rations with stones and a cup and never be cheated again. They spoke of the word king and agreed it would be used sparingly and only when it did not interfere with the word neighbor. Outside, the winter tried its doors and found them latched. It prowled the rose maze and left a white on each thorn like truth on a tongue. In the north, a girl set a lemon wedge on her tongue and closed her eyes and remembered the river that had once run past the Red Keep and how it had looked when the light, just for an hour, was kind. The night deepened. The plans grew plain. They were not grand. They were durable. And in that durability lived the possibility that when war came it would find a country that was not starving and therefore not so easy to persuade. They would be asked to bleed. They would bleed. But they would bleed with bread on the table, and so the blood would mean something more than fuel for a queen's pyre or a city's rumor. When they were done, when even Olenna's needle had tired of being clever and retired to her lap, Margaery set her hand on Jon's wrist. The Godswood's mark pressed a little into his skin, the old cloth's memory making itself known. He turned his hand and held hers.
No ceremony.
Only the acknowledgement that the morning would ask for them and they intended to be there to answer. In a courtyard below, a cat chased a leaf. In the granary, a woman who had been a thief yesterday counted sacks today and fell asleep with numbers in her head like prayers that have finally learned how to do their job. In Old Town, Sam leaned over a book and found, Not an answer, but a question better than the last one. In White Harbor, Wyman raised a cup and did not make a speech because sometimes the bread does the speaking and men who love words must sit and listen if they wish to be true. And far away, a wind that had not yet introduced itself rehearsed its lines for a conversation the world would have whether it wished to or not.